Or famous philosopher Patricia Churchland, who famously said, evolution is only interested in the 4 F's: feeding, fleeing, fighting, and reproducing. And she declares that truth definitely takes the hindmost. Or Michael Roos, the evolution in this case is that ethics is a collective illusion of the human race, fashioned and maintained by natural selection in order to promote individual reproduction. Now, I want to be very careful and say I don't think by any stretch of the imagination that atheists are less moral than theists. I just think it's very difficult for an atheist, if they want to hold on to something like moral realism, to make an argument for it without just assuming brute facts. And in that sense, I'm quite happy, I'm much rather have, in fact, an inconsistent atheist than an inconsistent Christian. I think we can go further than that. I think we can look at something like the grounding of our rationality. So here's one of my scientific heroes, G.B.S. Haldane. If my mental processes are determined wholly by motions of atoms in my brain, I have no reason to suppose that my beliefs are true, and hence I have no reason for supposing my brain to be composed of atoms. But on theism, I have very good grounds, I think, if I start from the assumption of theism, to have some justification for the rationality of my thoughts. I can go further than that. I think based on theism, it's likely that there is something like science, something like a world that's intelligible. And one of the most beautiful things, if you're a physicist, is the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics, the way mathematics allows us to peer very deeply into the structure of the universe. And the question is, why is that? Why do we have this unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics, a gift which neither understand nor deserve? Well, again, this is something that seems much more probable on theistic presuppositions. And the same is true of uniformity, the fact that the world is the same here and in other places, etc. And I think history of science shows that many of these important bases of science have the theistic roots. I also think that theistic assumptions help ground things like human freedom, and certainly scientism, with its focus on cause and effect, makes it, even probabilistic versions of cause and effect, make it really hard to see how I could argue for something like true freedom in my mind. There are other arguments, which I think we'll get to later, like the fine-tuning of the universe, which is, I think, highly surprising and interesting. I'll mention that in my response, why I think that's the case. But I think that those things point towards a God. So in summary, I've been provocative and I've skated over a lot of complex issues very quickly. But basically what I argue is that the fact that we have a universe that allows life, that allows free, rational, moral creatures, is something that you might expect based on theism. And there is some sub-clauses as well, that something like an incarnation is much more likely based on theism. Perhaps not even surprising. Something like revelation is perhaps not at all surprising. Something like a sensus divinitatis is highly unlikely, because why would God have his own knowledge of him be based on our education or our intelligence? I can even argue that perhaps something like the scientific method is more likely to work based on, if I assume, the sort of theistic assumptions. I think that if there is no God, the opposite view, then you have a questionable justification for a whole series of things, like moral realism, free will, rationality, fine-tuning. Even the scientific method, I think, can only be rationalized a posteriori. So unless you posit many brutal facts, you either have to let go of these things, in which you have a universe nothing but blind, pitiless indifference, or you have to put together a whole series of brute facts. And I think by Occam's razor, therefore, theism is much more likely on the basis of the evidence. With that, I want to thank you very much for your attention.
You have about 5 minutes, but if you need less, that's great. To react, he says fine-tuning, well, it is a possibility.
I need 20 seconds to an answer. Because in fact in my talk I gave an answer already to all the arguments that my dear opponent proposed. In order to have evidence arguments based on certain phenomena, you need to determine the likelihood of these phenomena given the God hypothesis. You can only do that when you can fathom God's intentions. I claim you can't. So there are no likelihood arguments at all. But of course, my opponent will like to hear a little bit more on these more specific issues, and he numbered lots of them, so let me discussed it extremely briefly. First of all, we got the idea of Alvin Plantinga that the existence of other minds is as difficult to prove as the existence of God. Well, we all believe that other people have other minds, so we should also believe that God exists. Now, I think there are lots of difficulties here, but the most fundamental one is a philosophical one, that other minds are not hidden to us, as most behaviorists and others believed. When we see other people, we immediately, when they smile, for instance, we immediately see that they are happy, and so on and so on. Their physical behavior is a criterion for their mental predicates, and so we have lots and lots and lots of evidence for attributing other minds to other people, but we don't have any of this evidence for God. So that's about Plantinga's argument. Then, yes, there was a remark that you said that we are innocent until proven guilty. So in fact you're shifting the burden of proof to the opponent. That's a good trick, but I still think that people who make a claim should be defended. Then there should be a natural tendency to believe in God, and you think that this natural tendency to believe in God is more probable given God than it would be otherwise. Well, there is a lot of empirical research that explains why people have this tendency. Research done by psychologists and sociologists. For instance, psychologists have discovered that little children have a tendency to interpret phenomena that are not human as intentional, say natural phenomena. That's an important cause of polytheism. Then there is an interesting speculation by David Hume, how you come from polytheism to monotheism. I will not explain it, but we can, by secular means, very well explain the natural tendency to believe in God. We don't need to postulate God for that. Then you claim that moral truth cannot be explained by philosophers unless by stipulating God, or that God makes moral truth more probable. Now, the interesting question is, what exactly is moral truth? And I think that I have a Humean view here. I think that moral truth is a correlate of our emotional reactions of approbation or disapprobation to certain situations, and we are very well capable of having these emotional reactions without being truth-tracking in some kind of more interesting sense. We can discuss that. Then you mentioned Sharon Street's argument, and that's very interesting. That was an argument against moral realism. But of course, Sharon Street doesn't say that moral truth is not a possibility. We might interpret moral truth in a very different way from the moral realists, and I will do that as well. So Sharon Street's argument is a good argument, but not an argument which pleads in your favor. Then Haldane thinks that the fact that we have true beliefs can only be explained by God. Well, the problem is you learn a language, and when you learn a language, in order to learn the language, people have to tell you which utterances are true and which utterances are false. So in learning the language, you learn what is true and what is false, and then you couldn't have the language when most of your judgments wouldn't be true. So here we have a perfect secular explanation why most of our judgments, at least about simple things, are true. Not of course about complicated things, that's God's existence. Well, what else? Theism would help to ground human freedom. Well, we can be very short about that one because Calvinists thought otherwise. Well, I think this is most of it.
Okay. This is working.
Sorry, not impressed.
Mr. Louis.
Great, so thank you. That was thank you for also your first contributions. I'm going to respond briefly to your first contribution, and then we can go back on these responses.
And just, you don't have to do it just as quick as you did it right now. It's
5 minutes. We all have 5 minutes.
You have 5 minutes, yeah, but we have some time for debate. So you could say, well, we go on with it, but you have
We can't change the rules, by the way.
I can. Mr. Louis.
Yeah, so Professor Phillips gave a series of arguments quite briefly in his initial response, as I think he had no. The fact that these are complicated topics about which people have argued for millennia, and the real outcome has been stalemate to some sense. That doesn't mean it's not an incredibly interesting discussion to have. one of the interesting things, I think Professor Phillips has written, I think, a book, I see here, it's coming out soon, on his arguments against the typical arguments of religious philosophers of religion. The vast majority of whom are, in fact, theists. And I think that would be an interesting thing to, if you're interested in these topics. I'm going to skip through this really quickly. The first argument he made was essentially a decision tree argument, which is either you believe arguments are not needed, a la Pontinga, or you believe arguments are needed. I think that's a misunderstanding of Pontinga. Pontinga simply says that you could be warranted even without arguments, in the same way that you could be warranted to believe that people have other minds without arguments. He's just pointing out that is a source for warrant, but he does actually care about arguments. He's famously argued about the problem of evil. He's given a modal version of the ontological argument. So he does care about those kinds of arguments. He just simply says it could, in some cases, be that you are justified. And I think, I don't think it's at all true that what he says is as easy to believe in God as it is to believe in other minds. He simply says, given the fact that God is personal, it wouldn't be surprising at all, in as far as we can understand him, what God does think. It would not be surprising at all that God would also create something that would be similar in how it functions, the way that we tend to instantaneously assume that people have minds, even though we don't necessarily initially have evidence of it, and that we can be warranted in that belief. In the same way, we might be warranted in our belief in God in a similar way, if God exists. So that, I think, is an important difference there. And I think it's important to clarify that point. And I think, more generally, the argument that, well, we don't know God's intention, so that kind of complete skepticism. I get people sometimes hold that view, but I don't think that's not really a view that you can do a lot of arguing with. You say, well, we'll never know. So it's kind of agnosticism, which I don't think is actually that interesting in the sense of what it actually will achieve for us. The second argument I think that you made is that you showed how Newton, for example, famously thought that there was he thought that God reformed the planets occasionally. So the argument is Newton comes to gravity, which beautifully explains the Keplerian orbits of planets around the sun. And of course, if the Earth is in an orbit around the sun by gravity, then Jupiter is in orbit around the sun by gravity, then Jupiter is, of course, pulling on the Earth. And if you think about that, you start adding these things up, then Newton famously thought that the planets would be unstable, which is problematic, which is why he postulated that God reformed the planets perhaps with a comet. Now, the interesting part of that story is that his great adversary Leibniz argued against him, and I've written about this a number of years ago. So Leibniz famously argued against this based on theological grounds. He had two arguments. One would be to say this demeans God's craftsmanship if he can't make the planets work right in the first place. And secondly, on theological grounds, he said that God doesn't do miracles for wants of nature, but for wants of grace. In other words, God doesn't do miracles in the natural world. He does miracles if he does do them for the purposes, his own divine purposes. And that's, I think, a biblical theological concept. And so Laplace really famously said, je n'avais pas besoin de cette hypothèse-là, when he presented his 5 volume Celestial Mechanics to Napoleon. It's actually an apocryphal story. The first story was actually about 50 years later. But who knows? It's a nice argument. Laplace himself was a Catholic, at least in name, he was Catholic. And he wasn't trying to make some anti-theistic argument, but rather simply pointing out that God had indeed sustained the planets in using the normal customs of the creation, the ordinary way that God works. And so I'm also an atheist on this God who needs to come in and intervene with the world, the natural world in this way, the so-called God of the gaps. But I'm an atheist on that for theological reasons and not for other reasons.